The rangers found him slumped against a pine tree at the edge of Bitter Ridge, looking more like a ghost than a man. His skin was gray, his eyes hollow, and his body so thin it barely seemed possible he was alive. They had been checking an old trail, not expecting anything but silence, when they saw him, Ethan Cole, the wilderness photographer who had vanished a year ago without a trace. Nobody believed he'd survived the brutal Idaho winter, yet there he was, breathing faintly, a living ruin pulled from the jaws of the mountains. What happened during those 365 days in the wild would soon become one of the strangest survival stories America had ever heard. When the rangers stumbled upon him, it didn't feel real at first. The afternoon light was breaking through the trees in soft, broken shafts. And for a moment Jack really thought the shape against the pine was just a fallen branch, or maybe a pile of old camping gear left behind by some hunter. Then he saw the movement barely there, a tremor of breath. What sat slumped beneath the tree was a man, or what had once been one. His clothes hung in tatters, soaked with dirt and age. His skin was the pale, sickly color of candle wax, stretched tight over bone. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't even trying to move. He simply stared forward with glassy, unfocused eyes, as though his mind had been left somewhere far away in the mountains. Jack dropped to his knees beside him, calling to his partner, Noah Pierce, who was still 20 yards up the trail.
"Jesus, no, get over here!"
"He's alive!" The words came out half as a shout, half as disbelief. Jack had been in search and rescue long enough to know what a year in the wilderness did to a man. No one lasted that long out here, not in the Bitter Ridge Range. The winters were merciless snowdrifts higher than a truck, winds that could tear tents from the ground, temperatures that dropped 40 below before dawn. The forest didn't forgive mistakes, it swallowed them, and yet here he was alive, barely but alive. Noah ran over, kneeling beside the man as Jack checked for a pulse. It was there, faint and fluttering, like the wing beat of a trapped bird. The stranger's lips were blue. His breathing was shallow, the kind of desperate, automatic rhythm the body clings to when everything else has shut down. His beard was long and matted, streaked with gray. His hair hung in filthy tangles down to his shoulders. His eyes moved sluggishly when Jack spoke, but they didn't focus on anything. They were the eyes of a man who'd stared too long into silence. Jack unzipped his coat, pressing his own body heat against the man's chest while Noah radioed for emergency evac. The static hissed in the open air, the ranger's voice cracking with urgency as he called in their coordinates. "We've got a live one. Male, maybe mid-30s, severe hypothermia, starvation. We need the chopper now." The dispatcher on the other end fell silent for a beat, as if she too couldn't believe it. When she finally responded, the tone was different, tight, professional, but laced with shock. "Copy that. You're saying he's alive. Is it confirmed?" Jack looked at the man again, at the faint mist of breath leaving his mouth. "Yeah," he said quietly, more to himself than to the radio. "Somehow he's still here." When Noah searched the man's torn jacket, he found a wallet, cracked leather, edges chewed by time and moisture. Inside was a driver's license from Montana. The name hit both of them like a ghost, Ethan Cole. They'd seen that name before, dozens of times, printed on the missing person flyers that had covered the ranger stations the year before. The photographer who vanished in the fall of '97. The one whose truck had been found abandoned near the South Creek trailhead, camera gear still in the back seat. The one everyone had given up on after the first blizzard hit. Jack swallowed hard. "It's him," he said. "Jesus Christ, it's really him." Noah froze, staring down at the man who had somehow outlasted a winter most seasoned trappers wouldn't survive a week in. The news had been all over local radio last year. Montana photographer lost in Bitter Ridge. Massive search ends with no sign, presumed dead. And yet here he was, the ghost of that story, returned to the land of the living. As they waited for the chopper, Jack and Noah wrapped Ethan in every spare layer they had: jackets, blankets, even the ranger flag from Noah's pack. They tried talking to him, hoping to keep him conscious. Jack asked simple questions, the kind used to pull people back from the brink. "Can you hear me? Do you know your name? Where are you hurt?" But Ethan didn't answer. His lips moved slightly, forming sounds that made no sense, fragments of words half swallowed by a throat too dry to speak. Every few minutes his eyelids fluttered, and he seemed to look past them, into something beyond. Jack had seen death before, but this was different. This was a man balanced on the knife's edge between life and whatever comes next, suspended there by some stubborn will that refused to let go. There was a strange stillness about him, not peace, not exactly, but something close to surrender. He didn't fight when they lifted him onto the thermal mat. He didn't flinch at the needle of the IV when the medics arrived. It was as though all his fear, all his pain, had burned out long ago, leaving only the faint embers of a body that hadn't yet caught up to its own ending. When the helicopter came, the sound broke the forest open. Snow and pine needles exploded into the air as the rotors sliced above the treetops. The medic shouted over the wind, strapping Ethan onto a stretcher and loading him into the cabin. Jack climbed in with them, pressing one last blanket over the man's chest. As they lifted off, he looked down at the wilderness spreading endlessly below, miles of ridges and canyons and frozen streams. Somewhere out there, this man had walked, eaten, slept, and somehow not died for an entire year. No one spoke during the flight. The medics worked in silence, checking vitals, pumping warm fluids through the IV, taking notes they didn't need to say aloud: hypothermic, emaciated, unresponsive. Jack watched the monitors flicker with faint traces of life and tried to imagine what kind of hell could keep someone alive this long only to deliver them back in pieces. When they reached the hospital in Coeur-d'Alene, the doctors took one look and moved fast. They cut away what remained of Ethan's clothing, just layers of rags fused to his skin, and began the slow, meticulous work of rewarming him. They covered his body in heat pads, inserted lines, measured his core temperature. It was 88 degrees deep hypothermia. His weight barely touched 90 pounds. His skin was a map of old injuries, frostbite scars, deep scratches, bruises yellowed with time. The attending physician, Dr. McKenna, shook her head. "A year out there," she muttered. "That's not possible." Jack stood in the corner, still wearing his ranger jacket, hands trembling from adrenaline and disbelief. "I saw it myself," he said. He was sitting under a tree, like he'd just given up. The doctor didn't respond. She was watching the heart monitor, the slow, irregular blip of a body deciding whether it wanted to keep going. "Well," she said finally, her voice soft, "he's got a chance now. That's more than most get." Outside, the sky was starting to turn the color of steel. The helicopter noise had faded, leaving only the hum of the hospital lights. Jack walked out onto the loading dock and stared toward the tree line, where the mountains rose like dark ghosts against the horizon. Somewhere out there, the wilderness had held this man for a full year and then, for reasons no one would ever understand, had chosen to let him go. That night, as the first reports hit local radio, missing photographer found alive after 1 year in Idaho wilderness, Jack couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Ethan's eyes, unfocused but somehow aware, like the gaze of someone who had seen the world end and come back different. There was a story behind that stare, something no camera could capture. Whatever had happened out there in Bitter Ridge, it hadn't just stripped him down to the bone, it had rewritten him. And in the days that followed, when Ethan finally woke and began to speak, America would learn what those mountains had taken and what, somehow, they'd chosen to give back. Before the wilderness swallowed him, Ethan Cole was a man whose life revolved around stillness, the kind found in mountain air before dawn, in the soft ripple of a lake untouched by wind. He wasn't famous by city standards, not the kind of photographer who shot fashion spreads or celebrities. His fame existed in a smaller, quieter circle. Editors of outdoor magazines knew his name. His work had appeared in American Trails, Wild Frontier, and the Western Journal. He had a gift for catching solitude on film, for translating silence into light. His photographs carried something raw and unfiltered, loneliness that didn't age, but hummed with meaning. People said that Ethan didn't take pictures of nature so much as he captured the feeling of being completely alone in it. He lived in a small cabin on the edge of Bozeman, Montana, about 20 miles from the nearest grocery store. The place had no television, spotty phone reception, and a wood stove that smoked if you didn't load it just right. Ethan liked it that way. The cabin was both studio and sanctuary. Every wall was covered in prints, snowfields, canyons, the ghostly outlines of trees at twilight. The air smelled faintly of developer fluid and pine. To most people, it would have felt unbearably empty. To Ethan, it was peace. For a long time, that solitude was enough. But something shifted in the months before he vanished, something subtle and hard to name. His close friends, what few he had noticed first, they said he seemed distracted during their rare meetups, quieter even than usual. His eyes, always sharp and curious, had taken on a distant, unfocused look, as though he were already halfway gone. It was around that time that his engagement to Clara Jennings fell apart. Clara had met Ethan 3 years earlier at a local art exhibit. She was an illustrator from Missoula, known for her murals of wildflowers and rivers. The two had connected instantly over a shared love of landscapes and solitude, though in different forms. For Clara, solitude was a space to dream and paint. For Ethan, it was a form of prayer. Their relationship was gentle, built on quiet mornings and long drives into nowhere. For a while, it worked. Clara didn't mind that he disappeared into the wilderness for weeks at a time. She said it was part of who he was. But eventually, even patience has a breaking point. In the spring of 1997, Ethan proposed, not with grand gestures, but in his own unassuming way, kneeling in their kitchen. Flour still dusted on his hands from the bread he'd been baking. She said yes through tears, but the promise couldn't mend what had already begun to unravel. Ethan returned from a trip to Yellowstone in early summer, distant, hollowed out. He rarely spoke about what he'd seen, only muttered that the light there didn't behave the way it used to. Clara tried to reach him, but he was slipping behind a wall she couldn't climb. Their final argument wasn't loud, just devastatingly calm. She told him she couldn't keep waiting for him to come home, not just physically, but emotionally. He stood in the doorway, unable to find the words to ask her to stay. When she handed back the ring, she didn't cry this time. "You love the wild more than you will ever love me," she said, "and I can't compete with that." Ethan didn't argue because deep down he knew she was right. After she left, the cabin fell silent in a way that felt heavier than usual. Ethan spent nights staring at the photos on his wall, seeing in them not beauty but distance 1,000 miles between him and everything that mattered. He stopped submitting work to magazines. The phone went unanswered. Even his brother, Mark Cole, couldn't get through to him. Mark lived 3 hours away in Spokane, Washington, a practical man with a stable job, a wife, and 2 kids. He didn't understand Ethan's need for isolation, but respected it until Clara called him one night, worried that Ethan might do something reckless. When Mark showed up unannounced, he found his brother sitting on the porch with a glass of whiskey, boots untied, eyes fixed on the mountains. The place smelled of wood smoke and unwashed clothes. "You planning on joining the bears?" Mark asked, trying for humor. Ethan's mouth twitched but never formed a smile. The conversation that followed was the kind only brothers could have, part argument, part plea. Mark urged him to talk to someone, to get out, to maybe visit family for a while. "You've been alone too long, man. You're not yourself." Ethan listened, but his thoughts were elsewhere, already drifting north toward something vast and wordless. "I'm fine," he said finally. "I just need to clear my head. There's this place in Idaho, Bitter Ridge. Hardly anyone's been through there since the 60s. I want to see it before the world ruins it." Mark stared at him, incredulous. "Ethan, it's September. You go out there now, you'll be hiking straight into winter." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe that's what I need." There was no convincing him. The next morning, Mark left with a heavy heart, knowing his brother well enough to recognize the finality in his voice. Ethan began preparing for the trip like a man possessed. He studied maps until the paper edges tore. He researched weather patterns, animal migrations, the geology of the region. He built his gear list with obsessive precision: a high-end tent, thermal sleeping bag, portable stove, first aid kit, freeze-dried food for 3 weeks. And of course his camera equipment: 2 bodies, 5 lenses, rolls of film sealed against moisture. On paper it looked meticulous, safe even. But it wasn't safety he was chasing, it was disappearance. In late August, he filed his hiking permit with the Forest Service, noting that he would be following the Sawtooth Creek Trail for approximately 2 weeks. He listed Mark as his emergency contact. The ranger on duty, an older man with weathered hands, reminded him about the storms that tended to sweep through early. "If you get caught out there past mid-September," the ranger said, "you'll be snowed in. People don't come back from that." Ethan nodded politely, the way you do when you've already made up your mind. That night, he packed everything into his old Ford pickup. He paused before locking the cabin, scanning the walls one last time. The photographs seemed to watch him, a gallery of frozen silences. He left the porch light on, as though expecting to return in a few days. But even then, a part of him knew he wouldn't. The drive north took nearly 10 hours. The closer he got to the mountains, the quieter the world became. By the time he reached the small airstrip outside Stanley, Idaho, the only sound was the wind scraping through pine. The pilot who flew him, in a grizzled man named Earl, had seen hundreds of hikers chase the wilderness dream. He recognized the look in Ethan's eyes immediately, the mix of grief and hunger, the need to lose oneself in something larger. Bitter Ridge doesn't forgive mistakes, Earl warned as Ethan climbed out of the plane. You keep your head straight and stay on trail, you hear. So Ethan just smiled faintly and adjusted the strap on his camera bag. Always do. The plane lifted off, leaving him alone in the vast silence. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and snowmelt. For the first time in months, he felt his chest loosen. Ahead of him stretched miles of untouched wilderness, ridges like broken teeth, rivers twisting through valleys no map bothered to name. It felt like freedom, but also like stepping into a cathedral where no one came back out the same. Standing there, Ethan Cole believed he was walking into clarity. What he didn't know was that he was walking into oblivion, a place that would strip him of everything, from his body to his mind, and then, somehow, give him back the faintest, cruelest gift, survival. The morning Ethan left Bozeman, the sky was the color of pewter, heavy with the kind of gray that promised early snow. He packed his camera gear with ritual precision, lining up each lens as though assembling a set of sacred instruments. The truck engine coughed to life in the cold air, its sound echoing across the empty dirt road leading away from his cabin. As he drove north, the mountains seemed to rise to meet him, their ridgelines dark and jagged against the pale horizon. The world outside the windshield looked endless, untouched, almost holy. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't leave a note for Clara or call his brother again. To Ethan, words had already failed him. The wilderness was the only language left that made sense. By the time he reached the edge of the Bitter Ridge wilderness, the air had changed. It carried the scent of wet earth and pine sap, something ancient that belonged to no one. The small ranger outpost stood at the base of the trailhead, just a log building with a metal roof and a flagpole bending in the wind. Inside, a pot of stale coffee burned on the counter. A park ranger named Tom Hardwick, a man in his 50s with a sun-leathered face, sat behind a battered desk covered in maps and radio parts. When Ethan stepped in, Tom looked with a mix of curiosity and fatigue. The look of a man who'd seen too many wanderers come through with big ideas and not enough sense. Name, the ranger asked. Ethan handed him his hiking permit. Cole. Ethan Cole. I filed the paperwork last week. Tom flipped through the document, squinting. Says here you retaking the Sawtooth Creek Trail. You re-going solo? Ethan nodded. The ranger leaned back in his chair, chewing on the inside of his cheek. You ever been out here before? Ethan shook his head. Not here specifically. I've done the Rockies, the Absarokas Glacier once. Tom gave a low whistle. Then you know what you re-getting into. Ethan smiled faintly. That's why I came. Tom studied him for a long moment. Something in the man's expression, the calm certainty, the quiet stubbornness, reminded him of others he'd seen pass through over the years. Men chasing something they couldn't name. He'd learned not to argue. You got a radio? Tom asked finally. Ethan patted the side of his pack. Satellite beacon fully charged. Good, the ranger said. If you get turned around out there, don't be proud. Call it. The ridge doesn't care how experienced you are. He paused, then added quietly, it's taken better men than you. Ethan nodded, thanked him for the warning, and stepped back outside. The cold hit him immediately, crisp and clean. A wind came down from the mountains, carrying a sound that could have been mistaken for a whisper. He looked toward the tree line where the trail began, a narrow dirt path disappearing into a wall of evergreens, and felt something stir in his chest, a pulse of anticipation that bordered on awe. He started walking. The first 3 days were everything he'd imagined. The weather held steady, the sky bright and cloudless during the day, exploding into 1,000 stars at night. He hiked long hours, his breath steaming in the cold morning air, his camera always within reach. He shot photographs of everything, the morning fog clinging to the river, the glacial blue of the lakes, the way sunlight blew through the trees like melted gold. Each click of the shutter felt like a heartbeat. For the first time in months, maybe years, Ethan felt whole. He kept to the marked trail at first, following the guideposts nailed into trees, the occasional stack of stones left by hikers before him. Every evening he set up camp in designated clearings, cooked his rations over a small stove, and wrote brief notes in his weatherproof journal. Day 3, air colder tonight, heard wolves. Beautiful, his handwriting was steady, confident. Nothing yet hid at the unraveling to come. On the 4th day, Ethan reached a fork in the trail where the markers stopped. According to his map, both paths looped back toward the same ridge eventually, but one was longer, steeper, more remote. He chose that one. The climb was brutal, but the higher he went, the more the world fell away beneath him. He could see for miles the bitter ridge stretching out like a green ocean, the horizon washed in silver light. It was the kind of view that made a man forget there was any place beyond it. Late that afternoon, he reached a clearing at the top of a hill. The wind had died, and in the stillness he noticed something glinting far in the distance, a shimmer of reflected light between two peaks. He lifted his camera, adjusted the lens, and felt his breath catch. Through the glass, he saw a hidden valley carpeted in gold grass, a perfect alpine lake lying at its center like a mirror of the sky. There were no trails leading into it, no signs of human presence at all. The place looked untouched, eternal. He lowered the camera slowly, heart pounding. The map didn't show a valley there. According to every record he'd studied, the terrain west of this ridge was impassable, dense forest, steep cliff, no reason for anyone to go that way. But the valley was real. He could see it with his own eyes, glittering under the afternoon sun. Something about it called to him, deep and wordless. For years, Ethan had been chasing the idea of capturing pure wilderness, a landscape that had never known a footprint. This, he thought, was it. The voice of reason, small and far away, reminded him that he'd filed a route plan with the Park Service, that going off trail would make it impossible for anyone to find him if something went wrong. But that voice was drowned out by another, stronger one of the same impulse that had driven him out here in the first place. He told himself it would just be a short detour, a few hours to take some photos, then he'd double back before nightfall. He checked his compass, took a bearing west, and stepped off the path. The forest swallowed him almost immediately. The trees here were older, thicker, their branches interlocking overhead to block out the sky. Every step was a battle, roots twisted across the ground like veins. Fallen trunks forced him to climb or crawl. He moved slowly but deliberately, marking his route with strips of orange tape, confident he'd find his way back. Every time he paused, he could hear the whisper of water somewhere ahead, faint but constant, like the promise of the valley waiting for him. By late afternoon, the terrain began to drop. He pushed through a final line of spruce and found himself standing on the edge of the hidden valley. It was even more beautiful than he'd imagined. The grass swayed in waves, shimmering under the low sun. The lake's surface was glass so clear that he could see every stone beneath it. For a long moment, Ethan just stood there, camera forgotten in his hands, feeling small in the face of it. He'd spent his life searching for beauty, but this was something else. It wasn't beauty meant to be seen. It was beauty that existed in defiance of being witnessed at all. He spent hours taking pictures, close-ups of wildflowers bending in the wind, wide shots of the valley stretching endlessly, reflections of clouds drifting across the lake. Each photograph felt like proof that something sacred still existed in the world. As the sun dipped low, painting the peaks in crimson, he finally packed up his gear and turned to leave. That was when the first flicker of unease touched him. The forest looked different now. Every direction seemed the same. The orange tape he'd tied to branches was nowhere in sight. He turned one way, then another, scanning for a landmark, but the trees closed in like walls. A cold wind swept through the valley, carrying the first hint of snow. Ethan hesitated, then forced a laugh. "Don't panic," he told himself aloud, though the sound of his voice startled him. He picked a direction based on instinct, the angle of the fading light, and began walking. Within an hour, the sun was gone. Shadows deepened, and the air turned to ice. The trail he thought he was following dissolved beneath his boots, replaced by tangled undergrowth and darkness. When he finally stopped to make camp, exhaustion pressing down on him, he realized for the first time what he had done. He wasn't lost yet, not really. But as he set up his tent beneath a massive spruce and listened to the wind rise through the branches, Ethan Cole began to understand what the ranger had meant when he said the ridge didn't forgive mistakes. The first morning after Ethan left the marked trail, the forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. He woke to a thin crust of frost on the inside of his tent and the faint smell of wet earth. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was, and the weight of it hit him, the valley, the detour, the endless wall of trees that had swallowed his path. He told himself it was fine, that he would backtrack after breakfast and find the trail again before noon. But when he stepped outside, the sky was low and colorless, the sun hidden behind a curtain of gray. Every tree looked the same. The landmarks he'd used the night before had vanished into shadow. Still, Ethan refused to panic. He'd been in the wild long enough to know that fear was the quickest way to make bad decisions. He packed up camp with deliberate care, ate a small portion of oatmeal, and took out his compass, east. The trail had been east of where he'd entered the valley, that much he was sure of. He folded the map, shoved it in his jacket, and started walking. The ground was uneven, sloping upward through dense underbrush. Branches clawed at his jacket. His boots sank into patches of mud that sucked at his feet. He moved slowly, stopping every few hundred yards to get his bearings, but the forest offered no clues. There were no animal tracks, no human footprints, just endless trees standing silent and indifferent. By midday, the clouds had thickened. A cold drizzle began to fall, light at first, then steadier, threading through the canopy in silver needles. Ethan pulled up his hood and kept walking. The terrain dropped sharply without warning, sending him sliding down a wet slope into a ravine. His knee slammed against a rock, pain shooting up his leg. He cursed under his breath, wiped the mud from his face, and took stock. No serious damage, just bruised. He climbed back to his feet and pressed on, slower now, the first whisper of unease curling in his gut. When the light began to fade, Ethan accepted that he wouldn't find the trail before nightfall. He found a clearing, small and uneven, but flat enough to pitch his tent. He moved through the motions, automatically set the stakes, rolled out the sleeping bag, boiled water for his dehydrated meal. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, and by the time he crawled into the tent, his hands were shaking. He tried to read the map up again by headlamp, but it was useless. Without clear landmarks, the lines meant nothing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard the ranger's voice, "The ridge doesn't care how experienced you are." He shut off the light. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds he couldn't name, branches cracking, the distant howl of something wild. Sleep came in short, broken bursts. Every time the wind shifted, it sounded like footsteps. At one point, Ethan woke, certain someone or something was just outside his tent. He held his breath, waiting. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. When dawn finally came, pale and weak, he felt as though he hadn't slept at all. He broke camp and started east again. The sky cleared by mid-morning, revealing a faint blue that lifted his spirits. He followed a stream downhill, reasoning that water always led somewhere, to a river, to a valley, maybe even to people. The logic was sound, but after several hours the stream veered north, twisting through thick brush. Ethan considered turning back, but the thought of retracing his steps through that endless sameness made his stomach knot. He kept following the water. That afternoon he stumbled across the remains of an old campsite, just a circle of stones where a fire had once burned, and the rusted frame of what might have been a camp chair. His heart leapt. He called out, his voice cracking the silence. "Hello? Anyone here?" The only answer was the echo of his own voice bouncing off the trees. The fire ring was old, half buried under moss. Whoever had made it had been gone for years. Still, the discovery gave him hope. People had been here before. That meant there was a way out. Over the next 2 days, Ethan's supplies began to dwindle. He rationed his food carefully, cutting portions in half. His body ached from constant movement. The blisters on his heels burst, then hardened into raw patches of skin. He kept walking, driven by stubbornness more than belief. He told himself that if he could just get to higher ground, he'd see the ridge or the river or something familiar. But every time he climbed, the forest only stretched farther, an ocean of green swallowing the horizon. On the third night, he set camp near a shallow pool fed by melted snow. The air was bitterly cold. Frost gathered on his gear before the sun had even set. As he cooked a meager meal, he noticed the silence again, how total it was. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals. It was as if the world around him had been emptied of life. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He sat by the weak glow of his stove, thinking about Clara. He could see her face clearly in his mind, the way she used to smile when she watched him develop film, the faint smudge of paint on her fingers. He wondered what she would say if she could see him now, alone, lost, surrounded by an expanse of wilderness that might never let him go. She'd probably tell him he was crazy for coming here, that he was always chasing ghosts. Maybe she'd be right. The next morning, the wind shifted. It came from the north, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that made the hair on his arms rise. Snow. He looked up and saw the first flakes drifting down through the trees. Light at first, almost delicate. By afternoon it was falling in earnest, erasing his tracks as fast as he made them. Panic started to gnaw at him now, small but growing. He stopped to catch his breath and realized he couldn't tell which direction he was facing anymore. The compass needle spun slightly, twitching as if confused by the storm. By nightfall, visibility was down to a few feet. The forest had become a blur of white and shadow. Ethan stumbled into a hollow beneath a rock outcrop and decided to wait it out. The snow came harder, pelting the nylon walls of his tent like sand. The wind howled through the trees, a sound so raw it felt alive. He lay in his sleeping bag, shivering violently despite every layer he owned. The thermometer on his pack read 28 degrees. He whispered to himself, half to keep calm, half to fill the silence. It's just weather. It'll pass. It didn't. When morning came, the world outside was buried under half a foot of snow. His tent was half collapsed, one pole bent, the guy lines frozen solid. Ethan dug himself out and surveyed the damage. His boots were stiff, his fingers numb. The storm had erased everything: the trail, his tracks, even the faint depressions from fallen branches. He was adrift in a landscape that had rewritten itself overnight. He tried moving east again, but the snow made every step an effort. Within an hour, he was drenched in sweat despite the cold, lungs burning from the thin air. The forest, once a place of wonder, now felt hostile, a living thing that wanted him gone. The stillness had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was predatory. As the day wore on, exhaustion set in. He stopped more often, resting against trees, staring at nothing. The thought crept into his mind that he might not find the trail at all. That maybe he'd walked past it days ago without realizing. That maybe there was no trail anymore. But even then, he couldn't bring himself to admit he was truly lost. Pride or denial, or maybe the simple refusal to believe that nature could beat him, whatever it was. It kept him moving long after his body wanted to stop. That night, the wind rose again, bringing with it the faint sound of wolves calling from somewhere far away. Their howls echoed through the frozen valley, haunting and beautiful. Ethan sat in the dark, listening, and for the first time since stepping off the trail, fear settled deep into his bones. He had crossed a line without knowing it. There was no map that could bring him back. Turn, he knew what that meant: frostbite. The storm raged for 2 days. Ethan barely moved. He slept in fitful bursts, waking to the sound of wind and the ache of hunger. His food was nearly gone. He ate snow to stay hydrated and chewed on strips of frozen jerky until his jaw hurt. The cold sank deeper each night, not just into his skin but into his bones, into the center of him. He stopped thinking in words and started thinking in instincts: warmth, shelter, survive. When the storm finally passed, the silence was deafening. The world outside was buried in snow up to his knees. He tried to stand, but his legs shook. His body felt foreign, slow to obey. He checked his feet and saw the damage clearly. Now his toes were discolored, waxy white fading to gray. He pressed on them and felt nothing. The realization didn't bring panic, only a dull resignation. A part of him, the rational part, knew he should try to clean the wounds, but the rest of him couldn't summon the energy. He wrapped them in spare cloth and moved on. For days he followed the river. He built small fires when he could, though his lighter was almost dead and his matches damp. Each time the flame caught, he watched it like a miracle, his only proof that warmth still existed in the world. He began to lose track of time. The days blurred together: walk, rest, melt snow, walk again. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, a hollow etch that filled his chest. He started to dream while awake, seeing flashes of light that weren't there, hearing music that faded as soon as he turned his head. Then one morning, he saw something half buried in the snow, a jagged piece of rusted metal glinting in the sunlight. He brushed away the ice and found an old steel trap, its jaws frozen open, its chain broken. It looked ancient, forgotten decades ago by some trapper who had once walked these same woods. Ethan stared at it, a strange mix of awe and sorrow swelling in his chest. Humans had been here. Not recently, but long enough to leave a scar on the land. The thought steadied him. He wasn't the first to face this wilderness, and maybe that meant he didn't have to be the last. He carried the trap with him back to his shelter that night, tucking it beside his pack as if it were a relic. Its weight was oddly comforting. Whenever despair threatened to overtake him, he would touch the cold steel, reminding himself that someone else had lived here, fought here, survived long enough to leave something behind. The trap became his talisman, a symbol of endurance, of connection to a world that still existed beyond the snow. That night, as the aurora flickered faintly above the frozen treetops, Ethan stared into the darkness and felt something shift inside him. The forest wasn't trying to kill him. It wasn't cruel or kind, it simply was, indifferent, vast, eternal. The only thing that mattered now was how long he could endure it. He closed his eyes, the sound of the river murmuring faintly nearby, and whispered to himself like a vow, just one more day. Winter arrived in full by the end of October, settling over Bitter Ridge like a burial shroud. The river that had once guided Ethan froze solid, its surface sealed beneath layers of ice, so thick it reflected the dull gray of the sky. The air itself seemed to bite. Each breath he took came out as a cloud that turned instantly to frost. His beard had frozen into small needles of ice, and his lips cracked every time he spoke, which wasn't often anymore. The silence had grown too deep for words. Sound traveled differently in the cold, muted, distorted. Even the wind seemed to move slower, dragging across the valley like something tired. Ethan's world had been reduced to the narrow circle of his existence, of the shallow cave beneath the overhang, the small fire he struggled to keep alive, the snow that pressed in from all sides. Every morning he woke with his heart hammering, half surprised he'd made it through another night. The hunger had changed him. At first it was sharp and desperate, a gnawing pain in his stomach that demanded food at any cost. But as the days stretched into weeks, the hunger dulled into something stranger, more abstract. His body had begun consuming itself, feeding on muscle and fat until there was nothing left but willpower. His hands had become skeletal, the veins raised and blue beneath skin that looked almost translucent. When he moved, his joints creaked like frozen branches. The once solid man who had walked confidently into the wilderness was now a hollow figure, stripped to the raw instinct of survival. He had learned small tricks to endure. He filled his sleeping bag with pine boughs for insulation, lined the cave floor with branches to keep himself off the frozen stone, and rationed every scrap of food until the rations were gone. When his supply finally ran out, he turned to what the land offered: pine nuts, bark peeled from birch trees, the occasional rabbit caught in a crude snare made from a torn cord of his tent. The day he caught his first hare, he cried. Not because he pitied the creature, but because the warmth of cooked meat after weeks of cold emptiness felt like salvation. He roasted it slowly over a fire no bigger than his hands, chewing carefully, afraid that eating too fast might shock his body. For the first time in months, he felt something like gratitude. But survival came at a cost. The cold was relentless, finding ways to reach him no matter how many layers he wore. Frostbite spread across his feet like ink in water. 2 of his toes had turned black, the tissue dead and brittle. He tried to keep the wounds clean, but infection had already begun. Some nights he could smell the rot when the fire burned low. He knew what it meant. He'd read enough wilderness manuals to understand that he would lose them, but the idea of cutting into himself in that frozen cave was unthinkable. So he did nothing, wrapping the foot in spare cloth, pretending it wasn't happening. The days blurred into one another, indistinguishable in the endless gray. Without the sun to mark time, Ethan lost track of dates. Sometimes he would scratch lines into the cave wall, trying to count the days, but eventually he forgot what number he'd reached. Sleep came in fragments. He'd wake in the middle of the night, certain that something was watching him from outside the wind, the forest, the darkness itself. There were nights when he swore he heard voices, faint and distant, like whispers carried through the snow. He told himself it was imagination, but deep down he wasn't sure. The loneliness began to rot him from the inside. Human beings weren't meant for this kind of silence. He hadn't spoken to another person in months, hadn't seen a face or heard his own name said aloud. To fill the void, his mind began to make its own company. It started small snatches of conversation he replayed from memory, things Clara had said, the way Mark had laughed at his stubbornness. Then the voices became more distinct. Clara appeared to him one night as he sat by the dying fire. At first it was just her voice, soft and warm, asking him why he'd left. When he looked up, she was there, standing at the cave entrance, bathed in the faint blue glow of moonlight. She wore the yellow sundress from the summer they'd driven to Flathead Lake, the one he'd always said made her look like sunlight. Ethan didn't question it. He was too tired to doubt. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. "I never left," she said. Her voice was calm, almost tender. She sat beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of paint and rain. "You just stopped looking." He tried to explain himself, to say the things he'd never managed to say when she was alive and real, that he was sorry, that he hadn't come out here to die but to find meaning, that the wilderness had been calling to him long before he understood why. She listened without interrupting, her face serene. When he reached out to touch her, his hand passed through empty air. The illusion broke, and she was gone. The fire crackled softly, and he was alone again. But she kept returning. Sometimes she came in the morning light, sometimes in the middle of the night when the wind wailed through the trees. He started talking to her regularly, as if she were truly there. He told her about the frostbite, about the rabbits, about how he sometimes forgot the sound of his own voice. She would smile, tell him he was strong, tell him to keep going. It was comfort, even if it was madness. Not long after, his brother appeared. Mark came to him one evening while Ethan was setting a snare. He looked exactly as he had the last time Ethan had seen him, clean-shaven, wearing a flannel shirt and that faintly judgmental expression he always wore when trying to hide worry. "You're an idiot," Mark said, stepping out from behind a tree. "I told you this place would kill you." Ethan laughed, a dry, cracked sound. "You were right," he said, "but not yet." Mark followed him for days after that, a constant voice in his ear. He pointed out mistakes, nagged him about wasting energy, scolded him for not rationing better. Sometimes Ethan yelled back, furious, arguing with a ghost about decisions that no longer mattered. Other times he wept, begging his brother not to leave. The forest didn't care, the snow kept falling, the wind carried his voice away. As winter deepened, Ethan stopped distinguishing between the real and the imagined. He began to believe that maybe the valley itself was alive, that it was speaking to him through the voices of the dead. When the trees creaked, he heard words. When the fire popped, he imagined laughter. The boundary between dreams and waking blurred until he wasn't sure which world he occupied. Yet even through the hallucinations, a small part of him refused to surrender completely. Survival had become an act of defiance, not hope. In January, the temperature plummeted to unbearable lows. The cave walls glittered with frost. Ethan spent most of his time inside his sleeping bag, conserving heat, emerging only to gather wood or melt snow for water. His body was failing. He could feel it in the way his heart labored, in the tremors that shook him even when the fire burned high. He had long since stopped feeling hunger. The mirror of the lake was frozen so solid that it barely reflected the sky anymore. One night, as the aurora shimmered faintly across the heavens, Ethan crawled to the mouth of his cave and looked out. The world was a wasteland of ice, silent and infinite. He thought about the man he'd been, the photographer who believed that solitude was purity, that the wild was a kind of truth. Now, sitting on the edge of his own disappearance, he understood how wrong he'd been. The wilderness didn't purify or enlighten. It stripped everything away until only the most primitive part of you remained. He whispered into the cold air, not sure who he was talking to. Clara, Mark himself. "If anyone finds me," he said, "tell them I saw it. Tell them it was beautiful." Then he crawled back into the dark, clutching the rusted trap like a relic, and closed his eyes, not expecting to wake again. But he did. Somehow he always did. When February arrived, Ethan's body was no longer his own. It was a collection of failing systems stitched together by sheer willpower. Every movement was agony. His legs had grown weak, his feet nearly useless, and his fingers had stiffened into crooked claws from frostbite. The infection in his toes had spread, darkening the skin up to his ankles. He knew the smell of rot too well now. The air in the cave was thick with it, mixed with the sore odor of smoke and sweat. He had stopped feeling disgust. There was no room for that anymore. All that existed was pain, and the fragile thread of consciousness that refused to snap. The days had begun to blur into a dreamlike sequence of survival rituals. Wake up, check the fire, melt snow, search for wood, set snares, try to sleep. He no longer tracked time, though sometimes he guessed at days by the changes in the light. When the wind howled outside, he'd lie still and listen, imagining it as a voice whispering through the trees. Sometimes it sounded like Clara, sometimes like Mark. Other times it was no one at all, just the mountain itself breathing. The line between what was real and what wasn't had long since vanished. One morning, while gathering sticks for kindling, Ethan saw tracks in the snow, large, deep impressions shaped like half-moons. They weren't fresh, but recent enough to make his chest tighten. He crouched down, tracing a finger over the print. Bare. The realization sent a flicker of fear and awe through him. He had seen plenty of signs of animals during the first months of his ordeal, but never this close, not since winter had swallowed the land. The prints led away from the frozen river, curving toward the base of the ridge. He followed them for a while, moving slowly, his breath clouding the air. By midday, he found what he'd half expected: a den hollowed beneath a fallen tree, the entrance rimmed with ice. The tracks disappeared into the darkness. For several minutes, Ethan just stood there, transfixed. He could hear faint breathing within, slow and steady. His rational mind screamed at him to turn back, but another part, the desperate, feral part that had taken over long ago, kept him rooted. A bear meant meat, and meat meant life. He retreated a few yards and waited, heart hammering. The minutes dragged by until, finally, the creature stirred. A massive brown bear emerged, its fur matted with frost, its ribs visible beneath the coat. It was smaller than the grizzlies he remembered from the parks, maybe a young one, but still enormous. The animal sniffed the air, then turned its head toward him. Their eyes met. For one suspended second, the world narrowed to that gaze, two starving creatures locked in silent recognition. Ethan's mind screamed, "Run," but his body couldn't move. The bear snorted, lumbering a step forward, then stopped. It looked at him, tilting its head, almost curious. Then, as if deciding he wasn't worth the effort, it turned and trudged away into the snow. Ethan's knees gave out, and he fell to the ground, shaking. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had come within moments of death, yet what he felt most was an overwhelming wave of connection. The bear hadn't spared him out of mercy, it simply hadn't needed to kill him. For the first time, he understood the brutal simplicity of the wilderness. Everything here lived or died according to its hunger. Nothing more. Nothing less. After that encounter, something shifted in Ethan. The fear that had haunted him for months began to fade. He stopped fighting the forest, stopped seeing it as an enemy. Instead, he became a part of it, moving through it as quietly as the snow itself. His thoughts grew slower, simpler. He hunted when he could, slept when his body demanded it, and learned to listen to the rhythms of the land. It wasn't peace exactly, but a kind of surrender, a truce between man and nature. He built better traps from the remnants of his ruined gear, using the rusted steel one as a model. The old trap had become his teacher, a reminder that survival wasn't about strength or intelligence, but endurance. Each time he caught something small, a rabbit, a squirrel, he felt a flicker of triumph, followed by guilt. He whispered thanks before cooking, a ritual he invented to keep the loneliness at bay. His voice cracked when he spoke, the sound rough from months of disuse. The nights were the worst. The fire burned low and the shadows seemed alive. When the wind screamed across the ridge, it carried echoes of the life he'd lost, the clinking of glass from his studio, Clara's laughter in the next room, the sound of traffic from a faraway town. Sometimes he dreamed he was home again. In those dreams, his body was whole, his hands steady, his camera clicking under a golden sun. He would wake with tears frozen to his cheeks, his heart pounding as the illusion crumbled. As March came, the air began to change. The deep, suffocating cold lifted just enough to let the scent of pine and thawing soil drift through the valley. The snow softened, water trickled through cracks in the ice. The forest was waking. Ethan watched it all with a kind of detached wonder, as though witnessing the world being born again. But he couldn't feel joy, only exhaustion. His body was failing faster now, the infection spreading despite his efforts. He had lost several toes completely, the wounds black and clean where the flesh had fallen away. Each step sent pain shooting up his leg, but he forced himself to move. Stagnation meant death. He followed the river again, limping along its edge. The ice was melting in places, revealing dark, cold water beneath. Once he slipped and fell in up to his waist. The shock of the freezing water stole his breath. He clawed his way out, gasping, dragging himself onto the bank. His clothes froze solid within minutes, turning stiff as armor. He built a fire with trembling hands and stripped down, huddling near the flames until the steam rose from his skin. He stared into the fire and thought, this is how it ends, not with drama, just with cold. But again, somehow he endured. His hallucinations returned more vividly than before. Clara sat beside him one evening, tracing the air with her fingers as if sketching something only she could see. "You're not dying," she told him gently. "You're rechanging." Mark appeared behind her, shaking his head, muttering that Ethan was an idiot. The two figures bickered softly while Ethan stared into the flames, torn between wanting them to vanish and begging them to stay. When he blinked, they were gone, and the silence pressed down harder than ever. Toward the end of March, Ethan's mind began to fracture completely. He started talking to the forest as if it were alive. He apologized to the trees when he broke branches for firewood, thanked the wind for clearing the snow from his path. One night, he stood under the pale green shimmer of the aurora and whispered into the sky, "If you were going to take me, do it now." The light flickered like a pulse, and for a fleeting second, he thought it answered. But the forest didn't take him. It kept him, holding him in a fragile limbo between life and death. His body wasted away, his mind unraveling thread by thread. Yet something deeper inside him, the primitive, unkillable spark of survival, refused to die. He began marking trees with symbols, crude etchings of circles and lines that meant nothing except "I was here." He didn't expect anyone to ever find them, but it gave him purpose, a record. A reminder that even if he vanished completely, there would be traces of him left in the wood. When April came, the snow finally began to retreat. The first shoots of green appeared at the base of the trees. The river flowed freely again, its voice louder now, insistent. Ethan stood by the water one morning and stared at his reflection, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man wrapped in rags, face shadowed with dirt and beard. For a moment he didn't recognize himself. The wilderness had stripped him down to something raw and elemental. He was no longer the man who had come seeking beauty. He was something else entirely, something the world would never quite understand. He turned from the water, gripping the rusted trap in his hands. The steel was cold, heavy, and real. It anchored him to the present, to the fact that he still existed. "I'm still here," he said aloud, voice rasping, almost a growl. The forest gave no reply, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. There was a strange peace in the understanding that the wilderness didn't owe him anything, not mercy, not meaning. It simply was. And for as long as he breathed, so was he. The thou came slowly, as if the land itself were reluctant to release him. The snow that had swallowed the valley for months began to sink and rot, breaking apart under the weight of its own melt. The rivers groaned, swollen with ice that cracked and drifted downstream in jagged slabs. The air smelled different now, earthy, wet, alive. For the first time in nearly a year, Ethan could hear water moving freely, the sound bright and alien after so many months of silence. He moved with it, following the current like a ghost clinging to the faint memory of life. His body was barely functional. His legs trembled under his weight, and his right foot was a mutilated ruin wrapped in rags he hadn't eaten in days. Even the bark and roots that had kept him alive through the winter were scarce now, buried under slush. Yet he kept walking, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant the wilderness had finally taken him. He didn't know how long he had been moving when he first saw the smoke. At first he thought it was another hallucination, a gray smear above the trees, too perfectly shaped to be real. But when he blinked, it didn't vanish. It drifted upward, steady, thin, and straight. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. The realization didn't bring excitement so much as disbelief. After everything, the idea that there might still be another human being somewhere out here seemed impossible. Still, something inside him stirred, a spark that might once have been hope. He started toward the smoke, each step an act of defiance against gravity and pain. His breath rasped like sandpaper. The snow gave way to mud, sucking at his boots, slowing him down. He fell more than once, scraping his knees and hands against the half-frozen ground, but each time he dragged himself upright and kept moving. The smoke grew darker, thicker. His heart began to pound. He imagined voices, laughter, the smell of coffee or stew. He imagined rescue. When he reached the source, he found not people but remnants, charred wood, a half-collapsed hunting cabin long since abandoned. The smoke came from a smoldering pile of timber that must have caught fire days ago. The wind carried the last of it upward like a cruel trick. He sank to his knees in the mud and stared at it for a long, too empty even for despair. The ashes were still warm, and he pressed his hands into them, desperate to steal whatever heat remained. His skin blistered, but he didn't care. He was no longer chasing rescue, he was chasing warmth. He stayed near the ruins for 2 days, scavenging what he could, a half-burned tin can, a few nails, a rusted kettle he used to melt snow. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts but by absence. Everything about it spoke of people who had once lived here, hunted here, laughed here, and then vanished into the wilderness the same way he almost had. On the second night, he sat beside the blackened remains of the cabin and talked aloud to the air. "You got them too, didn't you?" he murmured, staring into the dark. "The ridge doesn't let anyone go." His voice cracked into silence. The next morning he decided to keep following the river, though his mind had started to drift in and out of delirium. His thoughts tangled, looping between memory and dream. Sometimes he saw Clara walking ahead of him, her yellow dress bright against the melting snow. Other times it was Mark, waving from the distance, calling his name. He followed them both, though neither led anywhere but deeper into the forest. Days passed this way, walking, falling, hallucinating. His body moved on instinct, powered by something beyond reason. Then one afternoon in late August, the world shifted again. The air had grown warm, heavy with the scent of rain. Ethan was sitting by the river, too weak to stand, when he heard it, the low rumble of an engine. At first he thought it was thunder, until the sound came again, clearer this time, cutting through the trees. He lifted his head, heart pounding. The noise was real, mechanical, rhythmic, unmistakably human. He tried to shout, but his voice broke into a hoarse croak. He waved his arms weakly, but no one could see him through the dense brush. The sound faded, replaced by silence. Panic surged through him like fire. He forced himself to his feet and stumbled forward, following the echo of the engine. Branches whipped at his face, mud clung to his legs, but he didn't stop. He broke into a clearing just as the noise returned, louder this time. Through the blur of his vision, he saw movement, 2 figures in forest green jackets walking side by side along the riverbank. For a heartbeat, he thought they were hallucinations like all the others. Then one of them turned and pointed. "Jesus Christ," the man shouted. "There's someone out there!" Ethan didn't understand the words at first. His ears were ringing, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of light. The men were running toward him now, real, solid, kicking up mud and water as they came. One knelt beside him, his voice sharp with alarm. "Hey, can you hear me, sir?"
Hey, stay with us!
Ethan's lips moved, but the only sound that came out was a broken whisper. The second man pressed 2 fingers to his neck, then looked up, eyes wide. "He's alive," he said, barely, but alive. He tried to speak, tried to tell them his name, but his tongue felt like lead. The world tilted sideways, and everything went black. When he woke again, he was lying on a stretcher, the sky above him spinning. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades cut through the air. His hands were holding him down, covering him with blankets. Voices shouted over the wind, muffled but urgent. He caught fragments: malnourished, frostbite, code blue. He wanted to tell them not to bother, that he was already part of the mountain now, but his body wouldn't obey. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the helicopter lifted off. From the air, Bitter Ridge looked almost beautiful. The forest stretched for miles, green and gold, dotted with the silver of thawing rivers. No one looking down from that height could have imagined the suffering that land had witnessed. Ethan tried to raise his head, but a medic pressed him gently back down. "Don't move, sir. You're safe now." The word sounded strange, safe. He didn't know what that meant anymore. When the helicopter touched down in Coa d'Alene, the medics rushed him into the hospital. The lights were too bright, the voices too loud. Machines beeped, needles pricked his skin. Someone was cutting away his clothing, and for a moment he thought he was back in the cave, the cold pressing in. He tried to fight them off, shouting incoherently, until a voice said softly, "It's okay, Ethan, you okay," that stopped him cold. They knew his name. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in nearly a year. He spent the next several days in a blur of warmth and confusion. The doctors kept him sedated while they treated the frostbite, amputating several toes and debriding infected tissue. His body was skeletal, barely more than bones and sinew. He drifted in and out of dreams, Clara's laughter, Mark's voice, the endless whisper of wind through the trees. When he finally woke fully, he was surrounded by machines, wrapped in clean sheets that smelled of bleach. A nurse smiled down at him. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. He tried to answer, but his throat was raw from dehydration. Later, when he could speak, a doctor came to his bedside with a clipboard. "You were missing almost a year," she told him gently. "We didn't think anyone could survive that long out there." He wanted to tell her she was right, that the man she saw in front of her wasn't the same one who had walked into the mountains. But all he managed was a small nod. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, Ethan lay awake listening to the hum of the machines. The blankets felt heavy and strange after so long without them. He found himself missing the silence of the wilderness, the sound of the wind moving through the pines. The world outside the hospital window looked soft and unreal. When he closed his eyes, he saw the forest again, endless, cold, alive. He could almost hear it breathing. He didn't know why the mountain had spared him when it had taken so many others. Maybe it hadn't spared him at all. Maybe it had simply released him, the way the river releases ice when spring comes. Whatever the reason, he understood one thing clearly: he hadn't beaten the wilderness. It had remade him. And now, sitting in the fragile warmth of the hospital, he realized he would carry it with him forever: the silence, the hunger, the haunting beauty of survival. The first thing Ethan remembered clearly after weeks of drifting in and out of sedation was light white, sterile light spilling through a hospital window. It hurt to look at, too clean, too artificial after a year of wilderness shadow. He turned his head slowly, his neck stiff, and saw the faint reflection of himself in the glass. For a moment he didn't recognize the man staring back, pale, hollow-eyed, draped in tubes and bandages. His hair hung in dull, matted clumps. The skin around his mouth was cracked and peeling. He looked like someone who had died and been dragged back against his will. When the nurse entered the room, he flinched. The sound of her shoes on the tile felt intrusive, wrong somehow, like thunder in a library. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said gently, adjusting his IV. "How are you feeling?" He tried to answer, but his voice came out as a rasp, the words too heavy to lift. She smiled kindly. "Don't push it yet. You've been through hell. Give it time." She left him with a cup of ice water and the hum of machines. The water was cold, but not like the cold he knew. This was civilized cold, controlled, safe. It made him want to laugh and cry at the same time. Over the following weeks, the hospital became both a sanctuary and a prison. His body healed faster than his mind. The doctors marveled at his resilience, calling it remarkable. They said people didn't survive what he had. They said he was lucky. But Ethan didn't feel lucky. He felt displaced, like someone had pulled him out of his own story halfway through. His legs trembled whenever he stood. His balance was gone, his body a stranger he had to learn again. The physical therapy was agony, each step a reminder of how fragile he had become. He screamed once when they tried to make him walk, the sound raw and guttural, shocking even to himself. The therapist didn't flinch. She simply said, "That sound means you're still fighting." But the real battle wasn't physical. It was inside his head, in the quiet hours between treatments when the hospital dimmed and the walls seemed to breathe. At night, he dreamed of the cave. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the sterile sheets tangled around him like vines. The dreams were vivid, visceral, the taste of snow, the hiss of wind, the smell of smoke and rot. Sometimes Clara was there, sitting by the fire, her face serene. Sometimes the bear stood at the cave entrance, watching him with patient eyes. And sometimes he dreamed of nothing at all, just an infinite white void where time didn't exist. Those were the worst nights. The doctors called it post-traumatic stress disorder. They gave him pills that blurred the edges of reality, softening the sharpness of memory, but also dulling everything else. Food had no taste. Voices had no texture. The world felt flat, as though he'd been trapped behind a sheet of glass. They wanted him to talk to a psychologist, a soft-spoken woman named Jor Henley, who kept her office lights dim and her tone even. During their first session, she asked him, "Do you remember the day you were found?" Ethan stared at the floor for a long time before answering. "I thought they were ghosts," he said finally. "For a second I thought I died and the forest was playing tricks." "What made you realize they were real?" she asked. He thought about it. "They were loud," he said. "Nothing out there was ever that loud." She wrote something down, then looked at him again. "Do you want to tell me about the forest?" Ethan hesitated. How could he explain it? How could he make her understand that it wasn't just a place, that it had spoken to him? Not with words, but in a language older than thought. He tried anyway, haltingly at first, describing the months of isolation, the hallucinations, the unbearable silence that became a presence of its own. "There." Henley listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said quietly, "You survived something extraordinary, but you left a part of yourself there." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he couldn't. The truth of it lodged deep in his chest. The wilderness had taken something from him, maybe his peace, maybe his innocence, and he knew it would never give it back. As spring turned to summer, Ethan's body grew stronger. He learned to walk with the help of crutches, then without them. His weight crept back slowly, though the mirror still showed a gaunt stranger. He attended therapy sessions twice a week, sat through media interviews he didn't want, and answered endless questions from doctors and journalists. They all wanted the same story, the miracle of survival, the triumph of human endurance. But the way they told it made him uneasy. They spoke of courage, willpower, faith. They didn't understand that what had kept him alive wasn't heroism, but stubbornness, maybe even fear. He hadn't fought to live because he believed in life. He'd fought because dying felt too easy. The hospital released him in late July. He stepped outside into sunlight for the first time in nearly a year, blinking against its intensity. The warmth felt foreign, almost hostile. Mark was waiting for him by the curb, his face pale with shock. "Jesus, Ethan," he whispered, pulling him into an awkward hug. "I thought you were gone." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He stood there, stiffly, the contact overwhelming. The world beyond the hospital was too loud, cars honking, people laughing, wind rattling through trees. Every sound made him flinch. On the drive to Mark's house in Spokane, he kept glancing at the horizon, half expecting to see the silhouette of mountains chasing him. Mark and his wife, Julie, had turned their guest room into a small sanctuary. They stocked it with soft blankets, thick curtains, and an old record player. Julie cooked elaborate meals, trying to feed back the life that had been stripped from him, but Ethan could barely eat. The smells were too strong, the textures wrong. At night, he paced the floor, afraid to sleep with the door closed. The dark no longer meant rest, it meant danger. Mark tried to help but didn't understand. "You're safe now," he kept saying, like it was a spell that could undo the past. But Ethan couldn't explain that safety no longer existed, not in the way his brother meant it. He'd learned that the world didn't draw clear lines between life and death, safety and danger. The wilderness had taught him that existence itself was fragile, conditional, fleeting. Weeks passed like that, half-awake days, sleepless nights, endless questions from people who wanted to make meaning out of what had none. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the backyard, Ethan watched a breeze move through the trees. The sound was soft, almost like the forest breathing again. His chest tightened. For a moment, he wasn't in Spokane anymore. He was back in the valley, the snow glittering under pale sunlight, the silence pressing against his skin. It scared him how easily the memory came, how alive it still was inside him. Jeter Henley called it survivor's echo, the way trauma leaves its fingerprints on the present. She told him that healing didn't mean forgetting, that he'd have to learn to live with the wilderness inside him. He didn't tell her that part of him didn't want to heal. Part of him missed it, the purity of it, the raw immediacy of each breath, the way life and death coexisted without pretense. The modern world felt cluttered, dishonest. Out there, in the cold, every choice had been stripped down to its essence, live or die. Here, nothing was simple. In late August, almost a year to the day since his rescue, Ethan woke from another restless night and sat at his desk. The light through the window was soft, the color of early morning. On the table before him lay his old camera, cleaned and restored. He hadn't touched it since his return. His fingers hovered over it now, uncertain. Finally, he lifted it, the weight both familiar and foreign. He turned it on and looked through the viewfinder. The world framed itself neatly again, edges, focus, composition. For the first time in months, he felt steady. That afternoon, he began taking photographs of the backyard, the sky, the empty street. But each image came out wrong, too still, too civilized. He realized what was missing: the wilderness. Not its beauty, but its truth, the way it stripped everything bare. That night, he opened a new notebook and began sketching an idea: a year of silence. It would be his way of telling the story, not through words, but through images that spoke of endurance, loss, and the strange, haunting mercy of survival. When he finished the first draft of the project plan, he wrote one final note at the bottom of the page. Almost as an afterthought: the mountain didn't kill me. It changed me. Maybe that's worse. Maybe it's better. Then he closed the notebook and stared out the window, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere far away, the forest still breathed, and he could almost hear it whisper back. For recognition, it was an act of translation, an attempt to turn the unexplainable into something tangible. Words had failed him when journalists asked what the year alone had been like. He'd given interviews, told them the surfaced frostbite, starvation, disorientation, but they didn't want the real story. They wanted triumph. They wanted redemption. What he had instead was transformation, and it was far darker than they could ever understand. So he spoke in images. Every photograph in the series was a confession disguised as landscape. He shot them in black and white because color felt dishonest. He remembered the first day he returned to the mountains to begin photographing again. It was spring, 3 years after his rescue. The snow had receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud, moss, and rebirth. He had stood at the trailhead of Bitter Ridge, camera in hand, his heart hammering so violently he could barely breathe. The air smelled exactly as it had the day he vanished, sharp, cold, electric. The sound of the wind threading through the trees struck him like déjà vu. For a moment, he considered turning back, but then something quiet inside him insisted he keep going. He wasn't there to conquer the wilderness. He was there to make peace with it. He retraced parts of his old path, though most of it had changed. The forest had reclaimed the places he'd once known. The cave was gone, collapsed under a landslide. The river had shifted course. He found remnants of his old campsite buried under fallen branches, nothing more than a scrap of nylon, a rusted tin pot, and a single stone marked with the initials he had carved during his first winter. Seeing it was like finding a grave. He sat there for hours, the camera forgotten in his lap, listening to the silence that had once nearly killed him. But this time it felt different. The silence no longer threatened. It listened back. When he finally began to take pictures, it wasn't with the intention of capturing beauty. He wasn't looking for perfect composition or light. He was documenting what survival had done to him, the fragments of memory etched into the landscape. Every click of the shutter felt like reclaiming a piece of himself, a dead tree twisted into the shape of a reaching hand, the scarred earth where fire had once burned, the reflection of his face, gaunt and uncertain in a pool of meltwater. Each image told a story without words, not of escape, but of surrender. The A Year of Silence exhibition opened quietly, without fanfare, but word spread quickly. Critics called it raw, haunting, a meditation on the fragility of man against nature. Ethan attended the opening, not out of vanity, but out of obligation. He stood among the crowd and listened as people discussed his work as if it belonged to some mythic stranger. One man, a journalist from the New Yorker, asked him if the show was about fear. Ethan thought for a long moment before replying, "It's about listening. About what you hear when everything else stops." The man scribbled something in his notebook and nodded like he understood, but Ethan knew he didn't. No one truly could unless they'd stood in the kind of silence that devours time itself. After the show, offers began to pour in: book deals, interviews, documentary proposals, but Ethan declined most of them. He wasn't interested in fame. What he wanted was distance, a life lived quietly, far from the noise of interpretation. He moved north to a small cabin near the Olympic Peninsula, surrounded by mist and forest. There, he lived simply. He grew vegetables, fished the nearby streams, and photographed only when the mood struck. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, walk outside barefoot into the wet grass, and look up at the stars. The sky was different here, closer, less cruel. But every time the wind rose, he still felt the mountains breathing in his bones. The nightmares didn't vanish entirely. Some nights he dreamed of snow closing over his tent, of the cave walls closing in, of Clara standing in the doorway of his old cabin, her eyes filled with the kind of sadness that belongs to ghosts. But the dreams no longer broke him. They came like echoes, reminders of the life that had shaped him. In the mornings, he'd make coffee, step outside, and let the fog wrap around him. He'd whisper to the trees, the same way he had in the valley, "I'm still here." 3 years after the exhibition, Ethan received a letter from a young photographer who had seen A Year of Silence in New York. The letter was handwritten, the words trembling with emotion. "Your work changed me," it read. "I used to be afraid of being alone. Now I understand it's where we find ourselves." Ethan read it several times before setting it aside. He didn't write back, but something about the letter stayed with him. For the first time, he wondered if maybe that was why he had survived to leave behind proof that even in the most brutal silence, something human could endure. By the time he turned 40, the man who had vanished into Bitter Ridge felt like a story he'd once heard about someone else. The scars on his feet still ached when the temperature dropped, but he welcomed the pain. It reminded him he was alive. He no longer feared solitude. It had become a companion, one that asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply existed alongside him. Some evenings he'd sit by the fire and flip through his photographs, tracing the journey from suffering to understanding. The images no longer frightened him. They felt like prayers, small, wordless acknowledgments of everything he had lost and found again. One late autumn evening, Ethan hiked a short trail that led to a cliff overlooking the Pacific. The sun was setting, turning the water into molten gold. He set up his camera and waited for the light to shift. When the moment came, he pressed the shutter. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it resonated deep within him. He knew this photograph would be his last. He sat down on a rock and watched the sky darken, the horizon swallowing the light. For a long time, he said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. As the tide rolled in, he thought about everything the wilderness had taught him, the cruelty and the mercy, the madness and the grace. He realized now that the mountains hadn't tried to kill him. They had stripped him bare, shown him what he truly was beneath all the noise. Not a survivor, not a victim, but a man who had been given the rarest of gifts, the chance to start over with nothing but himself. He whispered to the wind, the same words he'd spoken years ago at the edge of the valley. The forest didn't kill me. It taught me how to live. And as night fell over the water, the wind carried his words away, mingling them with the endless rhythm of waves and distant trees, a promise, an echo, a quiet testament to a man who had walked into silence and returned not untouched, but awake. The story of Ethan Cole is not just a tale of survival, it's a meditation on the fragile boundary between man and nature, sanity and madness, life and existence. At its core, it's a story about what happens when a human being is stripped of everything familiar: comfort, companionship, language, even identity. When Ethan walked into the wilderness, he thought he was searching for peace, for stillness, a way to quiet the noise of his life. But the silence he found was not the gentle kind. It was absolute, merciless, the kind that erases. And in that erasure, he discovered something raw and irreversible, that meaning doesn't come from conquering the world around us, but from learning to live inside its indifference. Ethan's journey through the Bitter Ridge wilderness mirrors the inner landscapes most people spend their lives avoiding. Alone in the cold, he faced not just hunger and isolation, but the collapse of everything he thought made him human. The wilderness, in its brutal honesty, stripped him of illusion. It cared nothing for his talent, his regrets, or his pain. In its silence, there was no validation, no applause, only reflection. The forest became a mirror, and in it he saw the truth of himself, a man who had built his identity on distance, who had mistaken solitude for strength, and who had to be broken to understand the difference. It is easy to call his story one of endurance, but endurance was only the surface. What Ethan truly endured was his own awakening. The mountain did not try to kill him. It simply revealed what he really was when there was no one left to define him. Civilization often gives people the illusion of control: clocks to divide time, walls to hold out the wild, words to tame emotions. But Ethan's year in the wilderness tore all that away. Time became meaningless. His body became just another fragile organism struggling to keep warm. The self he had crafted, the artist, the lover, the brother, was reduced to instinct, yet in that reduction lay a strange purity. He learned that life at its core is both brutal and sacred, that survival is not about triumph but about harmony. You don't defeat nature. You learn to listen to it. When Ethan finally returned to the world, everyone called him a miracle. But the miracle was not that he survived, it was that he came back understanding what survival truly meant. The wilderness had changed his relationship with life itself. He no longer sought control or meaning in the old ways. He realized that to live is to exist in constant dialogue with forces greater than oneself: time, loss, silence, change. The people who came to his exhibition, who studied his photographs and spoke of beauty and art, could not see what those images really were: fragments of surrender, evidence of a man who had stopped trying to shape the world and instead let it shape him. His art wasn't about nature's beauty, it was about its truth, the quiet violence that coexists with its serenity. There is a temptation in stories like Ethan's to romanticize suffering, to make survival a metaphor for victory. But Ethan's lesson contradicts that. His suffering wasn't noble, it was necessary. It wasn't the wilderness that transformed him, but his willingness to listen when it spoke. In losing everything, his warmth, his health, his sense of time, he gained perspective. He learned that peace isn't the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it. The mountain did not forgive or condemn. It simply existed, and by learning to exist alongside it, so did he. That is the essence of his transformation, the realization that life is not about conquering the unknown, but learning to coexist with it, to make peace with the uncontrollable. Ethan's return to society also holds a lesson in what happens after survival. The world loves a comeback story. It wants its heroes to return, healed and grateful, with easy wisdom to share. But survival doesn't end with rescue. The silence follows you. The wilderness lives inside you long after you've left it behind. Ethan's struggle to adapt, his sleepless nights, his disconnection from noise and comfort, these were all signs that the wild had changed the rhythm of his existence. He carried the forest in his mind, not as trauma but as truth. The part of him that had died in the mountains wasn't meant to be revived. It was meant to stay buried there. His healing came not from forgetting, but from learning to live with the echo. What makes Ethan's story profoundly human is that it reminds us of how fragile our boundaries really are. Every person carries a wilderness inside them, a place of silence, fear, and raw truth that most avoid. Ethan was forced to face his. In doing so, he discovered that solitude is not emptiness, but presence, the kind that reveals what truly matters when everything else is gone. His year of silence became both a death and a rebirth. The man who entered the mountains seeking photographs emerged as something closer to a pilgrim, scared, haunted, but awake. The photographs in a year of silence are not trophies of survival. They are acts of reconciliation. Each frame says, "This is what it means to live with the wild, both outside and within." They remind us that nature does not exist for our admiration or our conquest. It is not something to be tamed or captured. It is a mirror that reflects our own impermanence. Ethan's work forces the viewer to confront that reflection. The snowfields and shattered trees are not symbols of danger but of honesty. The wilderness tells no lies. It takes and gives without reason. To survive it, one must learn to listen without expectation. Ultimately, the lesson of Ethan's story is not about escaping death, but about embracing life in its most unfiltered form. He learned that existence is not guaranteed, that survival is not promised, and that meaning is not found in safety but in awareness. The mountain didn't teach him how to live forever, it taught him how to live now. To be alive is to be temporary, vulnerable, and aware of the silence that hums beneath all things. That is the true wisdom of the wilderness. It reminds us that everything, even suffering, belongs to the same cycle. And so, when Ethan stands on the cliff in the final scene, watching the sun dissolve into the horizon, he doesn't see beauty in the conventional sense. What he sees is truth, the quiet understanding that nothing is permanent, and that this impermanence is not tragedy but grace. The forest did not kill him because it never meant to. It simply returned him to the essence of what it means to be alive, to endure, to feel, to be humbled by the enormity of the world, and to listen to the silence that connects us all. That is the real lesson buried in the snow of Bitter Ridge, that survival is not the victory of man over nature, but the rediscovery of his place within it. The darkness doesn't end here. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me take you deeper into things not everyone dares to face.